thank God, Jim Jatras, you showed up. Because I had other guests.
Sorry.
No.
We're a little late getting.
No, I'm saying that because one of my other guests canceled at the last minute. I'm just thanking you for showing up.
Sorry.
How you doing, man? You doing okay today?
Compared to what?
You said compared to what? Well, I'm glad you're well. I'm glad you're safe. I'm glad you're good. I'm Jim Jatras. He's a former U.S. diplomat, policy advisor, and analyst for the Republican leadership of the U.S. Senate. You are the person I want to talk to today. There are a few things. I have to start with this drumbeat that Europe is going with. So this is Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk. Donald Tusk made a speech where he literally said, we are at war. This is not Ukraine's war. This is Europe's war. Because we will look worse as Europe if we lose this war, and this war is for the future of Europe. Now, Lavrov has agreed. Lavrov has said, we are at war. Meaning the Russians at the very least accept this is a war with Europe. Are they projecting? Are they serious? Like all of the false flag stuff that they're coming up with, what is the objective of this? Is the objective to get into Ukraine? I've heard people make the argument that this is not about really invading Ukraine. This is not really about going to war with the Russians. But it seems like they're trying to create a pretext by which to invade Ukraine under this idea that the Russians are everywhere, the Russians are invading us. What is going on with this? You may have more clarity on this than I do in regards to what the Europeans are thinking.
I think Chancellor Merz said something similar too. I used the W word in describing the relationship with Russia. Yeah, I think they're deadly serious, and I think this is a lot more. Should be a lot more concern to Americans than it really is. First off, Jamarl, I would say this is not just a European problem; it's also an American problem. Remember that post that President Trump put up about Ukraine can take back all its territory, and we're going, the Europeans they could help them do it, and we're going to sell the weapons to the Europeans, and then NATO will give them to the Ukrainians, although we're NATO. The long and the short of it is Trump has. There were a lot of people when Trump came into office that drank the Kool-Aid, that he was going to be the peace president. He was going to come in and make a deal with the grand bargain, and we'd have spheres of influence, the Russians and the Chinese. And that was never going to happen. That was never going to happen. Even if Trump wanted it to happen, it wasn't going to happen. The only policy that could possibly work for the West going forward would be to try to trick the Russians into some kind of a truce, a ceasefire, whatever. Trump tried that up front. The Russians wouldn't bite. So then he switched gears a little bit and said, okay, well maybe we can have a tripartite summit with you and me and Zelensky. And of course, the Russians didn't bite on that. So they've tried a couple other things out. And I think they've now settled on the only thing that they think can work. And that is that they need to find some way to put a European force on the ground in Ukraine, not to police a peace or a settlement or a truce, because the Russians aren't having a truce, won't agree to a truce, and there will be no peace settlement. So they need to find some way to put some European forces on the ground. I don't think this is a division between Washington and I don't think there's a rift between Washington and the Europeans. I think this is coordinated, and that it's a division of labor, as Hegseth said way back at the beginning of the administration. So they're trying to find some way to justify slipping something in there, a toe in the water, to see what happens and how the Russians react. And of course, you hear a lot of people that are more sympathetic to the Russian side say, "Oh, well, the Russians will never agree to that. Well, they'll just destroy them. European forces that go in there, they'll be treated as being destroyed." I'm not so sure. I mean, because as you and I have discussed before, the Russians have been so cautious, so responsible, so concerned not to turn this to a direct war with NATO. Even though there's been provocation after provocation, even against their own their strategic forces inside of Russia, that they projected what I call a provocative weakness, that they basically invited the other side to escalate, because while one side escalates, the Russian side tries to be responsible. Let's not let this get out of control. Let's just stick to the plan, and we're winning now, and we don't need to escalate this thing. Oh well, they escalated again. Well, we're not going to react emotionally because we're going to just stick with the plan. This doesn't affect the outcome, and so on and so forth. So I can see a circumstance where some provocation occurs. Whether it's one of these drone things, they come up with something else, or maybe they do it like a Gleiwitz incident. We had like in Poland in 1939, we saw a report that some Belarusian and Russian dissident types were planning some kind of a false flag personnel attack somewhere in Poland or something like that. They could use as a pretext to, all right, well, Poland must act now. We'll put a force into Lvov or somewhere in West Ukraine as some kind of a guarantor of the Polish border, or maybe a Polish some Polish presence in Lvov, because there probably are still some Poles who live in Lvov, probably not many of them, something like that. Or maybe a small French force somewhere near Odessa, which is their historic stomping grounds from the intervention after World War I, something along those lines, where they see how the Russians react. Because if the Russians don't hit them, and I think it's a better than even chance the Russians would not. I mean, because we know that there have been NATO forces in Ukraine all along, but they've not been declared. They've not been in uniform under their own flag as those forces. I think that what they're going to do is play a game of chicken with the Russians and see if they hit them. And if they don't, they will expand that force, and then we'll end up with what amounts to a foreign presence in part of Ukraine to guarantee that part of Ukraine, and then they will work from there. I think that's more or less the plan.
Jim, that will be extraordinarily demoralizing if that's true. Like, you have to, I don't know how they don't hit that force. Like, because the moment that you have 5,000 troops in, you have 100,000 troops in. And you've shown, that the Russians are bluffing, which seems to be the worst case scenario from the Russian point of view. It's almost like you're forced to, almost like a program. You're forced to hit them. But you don't think they will. You really think that the Russians will be like...
No, I'm not saying I don't think they will. I'm saying I don't know that they will. I don't know that they will. And I think that their Western partners might consider it worth the risk, because they're obviously militarily they are in bad shape. And by the way, they don't have 100,000 troops to put in. In other words, so that it's easy for the Russians to rationalize to themselves, or more precisely, a certain Russian, a Mr. Putin, to rationalize to himself, that doesn't make any difference. This doesn't change the outcome. If there's a few Frenchmen hanging around in Odessa or some Poles in Lvov, does that change the battlefield in the Donbass? Does that change the way the war is going in the East? No. So rather than jump into a direct conflict with NATO, steady as she goes, stick with the plan. This doesn't matter. This doesn't change the outcome. And that has been his pattern all along. And so I'm saying it's possible that they might not. And look, let me be clear about this, Jamarl. If they end up hitting them, and we end up in a direct conflict now between Russia and NATO, the very thing that the Russians have been very keen to avoid, they have partly themselves to blame for sending this message over and over again that nothing the West does in terms of provocation will be responded to, because we don't want this to escalate. We don't want this to escalate. Well, then they're going to get escalation finally, because they've invited it. So, yeah, they're in a no-win situation at that point. I mean, obviously they're going to win on the battlefield, but they're in a no-win situation in terms of avoiding a direct conflict with NATO. If that force goes in, and even in a minuscule way, and the Russians are faced with either tolerating it and inviting more, or hitting it, in which case, yeah, the prospects of escalation go way up all of a sudden.
If you hit those troops, though, are they able to really use Article 5 in that case? I mean, after all, they invaded Ukraine at that point.
No, I don't think so. And this is where the Western side is going to have to tiptoe carefully as well. They're not going to want to put themselves in a position where they say, all right, if you hit these now, you're at war with everybody, and might as well kiss your rear end goodbye, because we're all dead. I don't think they want that. I don't think even they're that crazy. And the other thing we have to keep in mind, Jamarl, is we're talking about European governments here. These are governments that are hostile to their own population. I mean, they're democracies democracies, for crying out loud. Look at the theft we saw in Moldova just on Sunday. I mean, it was the most blatant theft of any election possible. We saw what they did in Romania. These are people who are afraid of their own nations, afraid of their own people. They're selling their own interests down the drain just so they can maintain this war with Russia. At this point, they haven't got into a hot shooting war with Russia. They probably hope they can avoid it, but for them, it's a Manichaean thing. You know, it's democracy against authoritarianism. It's Europe and our values, and the rainbow flag and everything else against the evil Russians who just hate everything that's good and decent. So there's no way they can walk away from this either. So it really is, and for that sense, it's as existential for the West, and not just the Europeans, but also for the establishment in Washington, as it is for the Russians. Because without the Russians losing in Ukraine, or at least preserving some Ukrainian state that can still be used as a NATO base, the American empire is kaput, and they don't want that. Because when all's said and done, this is about preserving the American empire, global empire, of which Europe remains its crown jewels. That's another thing. I'm not going to mention names. There have been some really smart guys on some of the podcasts are saying, now what are the Europeans going to do on their own now that the Americans are walking away from Europe and that the American guarantee will no longer, that's nonsense. The Americans are not walking away from Europe any way, shape, or form. We're simply enlisting the Europeans as the potential cannon fodder in case this thing goes wrong, that they can die. We're almost fresh out of Ukrainians. We need some Poles or some Romanians or some Frenchmen or something we can bolster those numbers with. But the idea the Americans are walking away from Europe, because if we walk away from Europe, how do we maintain our hold on the Middle East? I mean, how do we, without Europe as our staging area for the Middle East, how do we control the Middle East? And of course, that's not even talking about how badly things are going for the global American empire in Western Pacific and confronting China. They cannot afford to lose in Ukraine. And this really then gets back to the Russians. Are they going to see this as an opportunity to destroy the American empire and NATO and the European Union with a decisive victory in Ukraine, or are they still inching their way along in the hopes that somehow somebody somewhere will finally come and make a deal with them, which to me is the only explanation for their behavior thus far.
I know who you're talking about. He's usually a really good host. I don't know why he thinks that the U.S. is pulling away from Europe. I just assume that the U.S. is using Europe, like basically in the same way that the Europeans are willing to feed Ukraine to the Russians, that America is willing to feed Europe also. I guess there are two questions in this. One, do you think, so under this model, Trump has to get involved, meaning the moment that Europe makes contact, they're going to scream bloody murder. You know they are. Oh my God, the Russians attacked us.
Yeah.
And if Donald Trump, and let's say if the United States is working in cahoots in this plan, the expectation is that America is going to come to their rescue. Otherwise, why are they going to put their forces to get killed? Or do you see it that way?
That's back to your question about Article 5. And I think one way they're structuring this the way they are is they know it's a dangerous move. It's they're putting their toe in the shark tank to see what happens, whether the shark bites or not. And they want to leave themselves in out. If thing goes wrong and the Russians do hit them, they probably don't want to have an uncontrolled escalation either. But I think there's two things going on with Trump. One is he personally wants to appear that he's walking away. Because remember, Trump has to be the winner all the time. He's perfect. He's the smartest guy that ever lived. He's brought peace everywhere. He's going to bring peace to Gaza with that ridiculous 21-point plan, for crying out loud. So he wants to put himself in a position where whatever happens, he's done everything right, and everything that goes wrong is not his fault. Oh, it's Joe Biden's war. It's he has nothing to do with it, which of course is a huge lie. But the other thing is, what does the American establishment want? They want to put themselves in a position where we can endlessly support the Europeans, whatever the Europeans need, without getting directly involved, if we can possibly avoid it. So that's why I think they're structuring this in a way that if the Europeans go in there and they get bitten, then, if this wasn't Article 5, well, that didn't work, then we'll have to figure out our next move. But I think right now they're going to roll the dice. They're going to find some pretext, put some small European force in, and see what happens. And if the Russians hit it, they may pull back. and then figure out, okay, we have to figure out our next move. If they don't hit it, they will expand it.
God, I hope they have sense enough to hit those troops. I know that sounds bad, but it's a worst case scenario to allow those people to exist. And I get your point that Putin has done everything in his power to keep this isolated to Ukraine. He doesn't seem to want to expand this beyond the borders of Ukraine. And so in their minds, every move that he's done that was pragmatic has been weakness.
And not just the borders of Ukraine. A question I've been asking for months. I've asked Russians, I've asked Ukrainians, I've asked all sorts of people that nobody can give me a good answer to, is why there is no action against the regime itself. Why are they not hitting the presidential administration, the SBU, the military intelligence, the Rada? Why are all these people prancing around Kiev as though they had not a care in the world, sleeping soundly in their beds at night? All these foreign leaders coming in, it's just all for fun, for show and all that. Why have they not shut the Kiev regime down so that it could function and its personnel are running scared for their lives? There's a very good military analyst, I'm not going to mention his name either, who says that if there was a war between the United States and NATO, it would be a very short war, because in no time Russian Oreshniks would be hitting command and control centers in London, Paris, Berlin, Copenhagen, wherever, and those powers would no longer be capable of waging war. I think he's probably right about that as a technical matter. So why has that not been done to Kiev? Why are they trying to kill every man in Ukraine? Why is the war one of attrition where you're going to end up killing every man in Ukraine, every poor schlub who gets swept off the street and gets sent off to die in Ukraine, and that's considered humane and not killing a lot of Ukrainians, but not attacking Zelensky and his gang in Kiev is off limits. Why is that? Why are they fighting the war that way? Back to where I was saying earlier, they don't want to escalate. They don't want to do anything that might panic NATO into taking action in Ukraine. Well, they're going to get that anyway. So that's what they finally brought themselves to that juncture through their misguided, in my opinion, misguided restraint.
I do have a hypothesis on that, and I want to get your take on it, and then I want to move to Iran for a bit.
Yeah. Okay.
Is it possible that Russia has already assumed that they're going to be fighting World War III, meaning they've internalized, we will be fighting NATO? And in that internalization, they've made the decision that it is easier and it is better to destroy every bit of equipment, every man, every air defense, would destroy all of the stuff. Europe is in the situation right now where their governments are bankrupt. France is literally collapsed. Germany is laying off hundreds of thousands of human beings. Europe is not in a good place. They are actively saying, hey, we need to cut our own benefits in order to give more money to Ukraine. So is it possible that the Russian perspective is, since we're going to be fighting Europe anyway, we need to damage Europe before we even get into the war zone? We need to get rid of as much military equipment that Europe and the US has, considering they don't have the industrial base that they had before. They couldn't support the two wars in Ukraine and Israel simultaneously. And so is it that the Russian perspective is, look, we're going to be fighting them at some point. We need to damage them economically as much as possible before they get to the actual point of having some kind of military firefight with Europe and NATO more broadly. Give me your take on that.
No, it's entirely possible, and that's not an entirely irrational strategy if you look at it that way. Yeah, the flip side of that is you think that even if they thought that was likely to happen, they would also be trying to find some way to avoid that happening. And again, I think their behavior points more to the latter than to the former. In other words, that they're trying not to panic the West into a direct intervention. They don't want to have that war. They're trying to avoid that war, even though they have to make contingency plans for it. And I would ask the alternative question: would a decisive victory in Ukraine make that war less viable for the West? Okay, fine. Let's suppose, again, another thing they haven't done is destroy the bridges over the Dnieper River so that the army in the East cannot function and it would collapse. Would that collapse? And okay, so you're right. There'd be a lot of Western equipment that wouldn't have been transferred over and destroyed, along with tens of thousands of Russian soldiers who will have died destroying that equipment. Would have been better if that equipment never got a chance to go to the East. It just sat there rusting in Western Ukraine or back in Europe somewhere. Yeah. While basically Ukraine collapsed, and at that point, if Ukraine, the whole state collapsed the same way Syria collapsed or Afghanistan collapsed, wouldn't that have a more devastating effect on NATO and the European Union than trying to grind out a victory and destroy all the equipment and every man in Ukraine on a piecemeal basis? I think it's a calculation. I don't think it's a very good calculation from their point of view. I think the better explanation is that Vladimir Putin is a very pro-Western mind. He's always been of the view that he can make a deal with his Western partners. He's admitted as much with regard to people like Merkel. And people say, well, no, he's learned his lesson. I'm not sure he has. At least with Trump, it seemed to me that he wanted to say, well, here's a man maybe you can do some business with. We'll go explore the Arctic together or something. I don't know what goes on in their minds over there. But I think there's a lot of frustration, at least with the Russians I'm in contact with, that he still holds out hope he can make a deal with somebody. And I don't think so. So I think your thesis is probably among the constellation of thoughts that are going on in Moscow. I'm not sure it's the definitive one.
Yeah, that's unfortunate. If he still thinks that, that's unfortunate. You would have thought he would learn from the Minsk agreements, the Istanbul agreements. Like, these are not people that you can make deals with.
Well, the thing, Charles, I think it's very hard to, and this is not just him, but Russians in general, I think it's very hard for normal people to understand a psychopath. In other words, you talk to people and you project upon them. At some point, rationality will kick in. They'll wake up and smell the kvass and say, okay, time to make a deal here. And because that's the rational thing to do, I don't think they can really understand people who are not rational. Yeah,
I live here. And when I'm looking at Iran and what Iran is doing, I often say, dude, I live here. I know how these people act. I know what's in their minds. They're not giving up promises. Yeah, exactly. They want your existence. It's not about the news.
Case in point. They don't want to make a deal with you. They want to destroy you. Can't you get that through your thick skull? I don't think they do.
Wow. Maybe it's a virtue of living here when you realize that they just don't. Yeah, they don't entirely see it. I don't get it. One last point for this: oil wars. It seems that Ukraine and the U.S., in a policy sense, have decided, okay, we need to depreciate or deprive Russia of energy, and in depriving Russia of energy, we can minimize their capability to continue and fight the war. Trump said it at that speech at the military himself. He was like, "We need leverage. We need, to be strong in order to make a deal." And he realizes, I think, on some level, I have no cards in this. I can go to nuclear war, but that's not really a win. I need to find some other leverage. And so Zelensky and Trump have effectively been bombing one oil field after the next. They've been doing it. I think this is like the fifth one that they bombed. And so it seems like this plan is very straightforward and clear. We need to hit energy systems. And Russia just looks at it and says, yeah, we're not changing our plan. That's okay. We can suck it up. Give me your take on this. What do you think?
Well, the two things. One is, I don't think that given the size of Russia and the size of its energy industry, the Ukrainians can really disrupt it that badly. I mean, they can do some damage. I don't think they can really change the overall picture, but it does illustrate the point we were making earlier, that the Russians are inviting more attacks of this sort because they treat them as something they can shrug their shoulders and say, well, it doesn't affect the big picture, which it doesn't. Therefore, we'll just tolerate it. And again, they can expect more of the same. If that escalation, those proddings don't get their attention, then they'll do something else. That's where we get into all this talk about the Tomahawk cruise missile and all the rest of it, which are nuclear capable systems. At what point is an escalation one that the Russians will sit up and say, you know what, this one actually matters? Maybe when a nuke Moscow, then they'll say, oh, well, wait, that one was actually significant. I guess we better worry about that one.
Yeah, because up to this point, it seems like they've just shrugged their shoulders. We're staying with the plan. Yeah. Everything is okay on the battlefield. We're just going to keep it moving. Yeah. Wow. I want to move to Iran for a bit. So there have been 10 tankers and carriers, not tank carriers, 10 tankers and what are these things called? These massive cargo planes that have effectively landed in Al Udeid Air Base in Qatar. Now, I had Colonel Wilkerson on the show. Colonel Wilkerson said before Thanksgiving, Israel is going to attack Iran. He was like very clear, before Thanksgiving, it's going to happen. And I've had other guests who have said the same thing. Like, look, they are prepping for an attack.
Right.
The last time that the United States did this, there was an attack. Are you seeing this? Is that in your mind also? Do you believe that?
Yeah, I would defer to Colonel Wilkerson on this. I've been saying before the end of the year, and that could be like any time, really. It really depends on when Israel believes they're in a position to move forward on such an attack, and when they have sufficient backup from the United States ready to, that they feel confident in launching that attack. But I have to tell you is that it really puts the Iranians in a tight spot too, because no matter how much they have recovered from the mistakes they made back before the 12-day war, as they call it, and the vulnerabilities that they had left open, however much they've closed those windows of vulnerability, they always have to keep in mind is that if the chips are down and the Iranians hit back and hit back hard, the Israelis will use nuclear weapons on them. And I think that they've been very clear. In fact, somebody was referring to something written by Jonathan Pollard recently saying that that's the way this is going to end up. Eventually, the Israelis will use nuclear weapons on Iran. I don't know how the Iranians avert that threat. And even if there is a relaunch of the war, which I believe there will be, and the Iranians get the better side of that exchange this time, which actually I think they did last time, but even more decisively this time, how do they get out of that without being utterly destroyed by nuclear weapons? And I don't know. I don't have the answer to that.
I don't have an answer to that either. What happens when Israel launches a nuke? How does either the world takes it? What does Iran do after that? I am very foggy on that, and I have not been able to get an answer from anybody on that question. It's almost like that is so beyond the pale, because it puts you in the mind. Do you remember? It was in the U.S. Guy gets into a fight. Cops tell the guy to leave. Meaning he calls the cops. He says, "Leave. Don't get involved." He continues, gets into a fight, and then pulls out a gun. The other guy doesn't have a gun and murders the guy. And so it's like, so you're going into an unprovoked fight, knowing full well that you have nukes.
Right.
That's outrageous, right? And so you are fighting a country that is 3 times the size of Iraq, has 90 million people. You're a country of 8 million people. Mm-hmm. So you obviously are going to get bashed, which means those nukes are obviously going to have to be utilized at some point in that fight. So you're going into this on some level knowing that these nukes are going to be utilized. What does the world do when that happens?
Just between you and me and the lamppost, I don't think the world does a damn thing. I mean, we hear a lot of people saying, well, if the Israelis ever use nukes, that would be the end of Israel because the whole world will condemn Israel, blah, 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 blah. I don't think so at all. I really don't think so. What, are the Russians and the Chinese going to nuke Israel because Israel nuked Iran? I don't think they will. Will the Americans condemn Israel for that? Not on your life. We'll cheer them on. So now I think the more likely immediate effect would be a number of other countries would clench their teeth and said, damn, we better get us some nukes right now. Like, for example, we saw this recent agreement between Saudi Arabia and Pakistan that almost certainly had an understanding about Saudi access to nuclear weapons. I wouldn't be at all surprised if like a week after such a thing happened, Saudi declared itself a nuclear power. So I wouldn't be surprised at that, or Turkey, maybe some other countries, maybe even Egypt. So I think that could happen. I think partly it depends with regard to Iran. If there's, do the Israelis just use a nuclear weapon in a low yield nuclear weapon to send a message to the Iranians? Okay, it's this or destruction, and the Iranians can still have the capability to come back, maybe acquire a weapon themselves. I think if it comes to that, the Israelis will probably just utterly obliterate Iran and make that an object lesson. See what happens to anybody who crosses us. I think that's the more likely thing, which is why I think the Iranians have made a huge mistake by not acquiring a nuclear weapon up to this point. I've been saying all along, they got a choice. They can be Libya or they can be North Korea. Yeah. So far, they've chosen to be Libya. And, and I'm sure Kim Jong-un is sitting over there saying, well, look, I mean, I played my cards right. I'm not going anywhere because I actually got nukes.
Yeah, this religious argument fails to me. I just find, God, man, I hate that. They're like, whoa,
I don't take that seriously. Yeah.
You don't think it's a religious thing? What do you think is the rationale?
No. Look, I mean,
'Cause
thought
I
was
agree with
like
you.
Talmudic rulings or whatever it is here, whatever the Pope says about the death penalty this week. I mean, they'll change that as suits their needs.
It's like, I know for the last 30 years that we've said no nukes, but damn it, we need a nuke now. Does Israel
God
really have the
changed his
capability?
mind.
Yeah, right. right. Does Israel really have the capability of decimating Iran like that? I mean, a country that size, do they have that many nukes with that capability? And keep in mind, if they do that, that still may not stop Iran's capacity to respond. Like, Iran may have those weapon systems where they can just immediately respond in a way where they have no F's to give, and this is existential. We're going to destroy your little colony at this point. I mean, like,
Yeah,
Israel, right? Or is it not?
I don't look. Again, it depends on how the thing unfolds and who does what first to whom, and at what point the Israelis decide to launch that strike. But my understanding is they have between 200 and 400 warheads, and that's a fairly old figure. They might even have more than that, as far as I know. How many cities of any size are there in Iran? Certainly not 400. I mean, if you destroy Tehran and Isfahan and go down the list of all the other cities that could be destroyed, what's left of Iran at that point?
But that also affects Pakistan. I mean, it's going to turn that place into a nuclear wasteland, and that stuff is just going to blow to Pakistan. Like, it does affect other countries in the region. Like, that's has to be significant.
Yeah, yeah. I'm sure Bibi will lose a lot of sleep over that.
But you don't think Pakistan will respond to the fact that they've been irradiated also?
I don't know what they would do about it exactly. They're going to launch nuclear weapons against Israel, and then what would India do? I mean, there's a whole lot of there are a whole lot of moving parts here. Like I said, my guess is that the Israelis did it. Nothing would happen in the short term. Now, would that destroy what's left of Israel's international credibility, et cetera, et cetera? Well, that's pretty much gone. The only thing that's left is absolute 199% support from the United States, and that would not change one bit. In fact, it might even be intensified.
So, with Iran being a linchpin to this kind of multipolarity, especially between China and Russia, do you think this pulls in other countries? Like, the moment that this notion of "we will nuke you" becomes part of the marquee, part of the conversation, other countries should stay out? Like, this, I guess what I'm asking is, national security of Russia, does that include Iran? And does the national security of China on some level include Iran? At least to the degree where they would, let's say, vocalize this is a no-no far more stridently than they have up to this point.
Ooh, they'll vocalize.
You bet.
Yeah. But what they do, I mean, it's one thing to say that we will support Iran to whatever extent we can. We'll send them air defense system. We'll, support them financially. We'll do all sorts of stuff. It's another thing to get into a shooting war with the West over Iran, especially if at that point Iran has been destroyed. How does that help? Again, go back to what we were talking about with regard to Ukraine. Russia's approach has always been one of caution, caution, caution. Chinese are even more cautious than the Russians are, at the point where then they've been presented with a fait accompli and Iran has been destroyed. What does that gain them to jump in with both feet in a war with whom at that point? With the Israelis? How do they benefit from that? Especially since they then know that the United States would respond very directly and we would be in World War III at that point. Everything they tried to avoid. Now, the fact is, Jamarl, as you said earlier, maybe they already figured World War III is here. These are just the opening shots of a global conflict where the Ukraine and the Middle Eastern theaters are starting to merge at this point. And it can't be avoided. Maybe they've come to that conclusion. I don't know. If that's the case, I don't know what their overall war plans are.
Wow. This is morbid. This is very morbid.
Yeah, well, yeah, I can look at the bright side, Jamarl. I'm really old, so I don't really care that much at this point. Okay, I worry about my grandchildren and everybody else, but there's not much I can do about some things. So it's been nice knowing your job.
Yeah, I know. I guess let me ask this last thing before I let you go. Before a nuke is used, I guess my thing is,
Yeah,
and maybe I'm wrong on this, I just considered Iran to be extraordinarily important for the security of Russia and for China. And
it
that's
is.
not a
Yeah.
country that they wouldn't have let just get nuked. And I mean, getting involved before the nuke falls.
But
I don't
what can
know.
they do?
I guess
What can they do?
maybe
What can
more
they
thought.
do? As a practical matter, what could they do to prevent it?
See, I don't have the answer to that. That's the rub.
I don't either.
I mean, short of getting directly involved into the war, I don't know have an answer for that question. And I don't know if they're going to do that.
Yeah. Yeah. And if they did get directly involved, what exactly would they do? I mean, look, there's been suggestions that maybe some of the Iranian aircraft are actually being piloted by Russians, that they're actually Russians manning a lot of the air defense systems. In other words, they are involved in a way that is fairly direct at this point, but I'm not sure from a capabilities point of view what they could actually do to forestall. The one big question, back to the Israelis and using nuclear weapons, they do have the problem of delivery. And I don't know exactly how they would solve that problem. Apparently, the whole issue of coming in through Azerbaijan, which they did during the 12-day war, apparently that vulnerability has been closed. I don't know for sure if it has, but I've heard reports to that effect. I don't think they have a ballistic missile capability to deliver nuclear weapons, so they would have to do it by air, and then that does present a problem. And now, can they do that? Can they do that without American help? I don't think they can. Would they have American help? I think they would, because when all's said and done, I think Donald Trump may resist on some level what Bibi wants done. That maybe makes things difficult for Donald Trump personally. But when chips are down and Bibi wants something, Trump is not going to oppose him.
Jim, this has been illuminating. I greatly appreciate your point of view, and I agree with your point of view. I try to make things more clear, which is why I give tension. Yeah. But I agree with your take on this. In fact, I agree with your take on all of this. That is unfortunate. But I thank you for it. I really do. Jim Jatras, man, thank you for this. Always appreciate having a conversation with you. Always appreciate your take on this. He is a former U.S. diplomat, policy advisor, analyst for the Republican leadership in the U.S. Senate. Jim, you have a fantastic rest of your day, okay?
You too.
Bye-bye.